Hello and welcome to NPTEL course on Foundation for Virtual and Augmented Reality Systems. We are going to start our lecture number 3 on definitions. Now, in the previous 2 lectures, we have covered few things, namely we introduced some terms such as AR, MR, VR, XR. We also tried to get a very broad level understanding of these terms and learn the importance of these terms, why they are relevant, why we should know about them in terms of market size and need for skilled manpower. So, we tried to establish that this emerging technology area is a very important one and it is for everybody's benefit if we know about them. And also in the previous lecture we covered some application domains and system categories. In this lecture what we are going to do is try to delve a little bit deeper into these terms in terms of more precise definitions of some of the terms that we have introduced earlier. So, we will be covering some definitions related to both VR and AR technologies, and also we will try to identify the defining characteristics of these technologies which help us to differentiate between them or to get a better understanding of them. So, let us begin with virtual reality. Later on we will move to augmented reality. Now, as you can notice, VR or virtual reality comprises of 2 terms, virtual and reality. Each of these terms is significant. Let us try to first understand what each of these terms are, how they are defined. So, when I say virtual, what I refer to? Virtual is by definition, by dictionary definition, is being in essence or effect, but not in fact. Of course, this is kind of a bit complicated definition, being in essence or effect, but not in fact, something which is there, but which we cannot actually attribute to any factual things. So, this is according to Webster's New Universal Dictionary. Similarly, if we go by the dictionary definition of the term reality, what we get? The state or quality of being real. Now, this of course does not make anything clear. It is a kind of using the term to define itself. Another way of defining it is something that exists independently of ideas concerning it. That means being in fact, whereas in virtual things are not being in fact. So, if we try to relate the two, virtual means something that is not there in fact, whereas reality is something that is there in fact, irrespective of whether any ideas concerning it are there or not. Another way of defining it is something that constitutes a real or actual thing as distinguished from something that is merely apparent. Now, something that is merely apparent is of course virtual or unreal, whereas something that constitutes a real or actual thing is reality. These are different ways to define the term reality. Now, when we put them together, we get virtual reality. So, how to define this combination of terms, virtual reality? Let us again go by dictionary definition, Merriam-Webster's dictionary, which says a virtual reality is an artificial environment which is experienced through sensory stimuli as sights and sounds provided by a computer and in which one's actions partially determine what happens in the environment. So, there are several important things to note here. As per definition, an artificial environment which is experienced through sensory stimuli as sights and sounds, it can be other sensory stimuli as well, but sights and sounds play a primary role, provided by a computer and in which one's actions partially determine what happens in the environment. So, these are part of the dictionary definition of virtual reality. Now, if we look at this definition, we can find out three crucial aspects in the definition. Artificial environment, experienced through sensory stimuli provided by a computer, and user actions partially determine what happens in the environment. Let us try to understand what these mean. Another thing to note here is that these aspects can help us characterize a VR system. So, whichever system is having these characteristics, they are VR systems, or rather whichever system is having these aspects, we can categorize them as VR systems. And in this way, we will be able to identify VR system as well as distinguish VR systems from other systems. So, other systems are not supposed to have these characteristics, these aspects vis-a-vis VR systems. Now, let us try to understand these three characteristics in details. First characteristic, what it says, artificial or synthetic environment. So, the definition indicates that a VR system must have an artificial environment. So, when we say artificial, here we specifically refer to a computer generated environment. Thus, a VR system is not a real environment, and VR system which is an artificial environment must be populated with artificial objects. So, in other words, we have an artificial environment populated with artificial object, which is one of the characteristics of a VR system. Now, before I move to the second characteristics, let us try to understand this in a little bit more detail. So, what we have said is specifically a VR environment is computer generated graphical representation of two things, a real world or it can be an imaginary or fantastic world. So, whenever we say artificial environment, immediately the image that comes to our mind is something that is fantastic, imaginary, rather than something resembling a real world scenario. However, in VR we can recreate real world using real world imagery, videos, something, but in a computer. So, that can still be counted as a VR system because that is not real time. It is created using real world imagery or video, but it is not real time. So, changes are not happening in real time. Say for example, this image of this Taj Mahal. Now, if we are using it in a virtual tour or in a virtual environment, we are actually using real world imagery, real world representation of a real world object, but still it will be a virtual reality system because it represents a computer generated scenario, maybe using real world. On the other hand, imaginary world representation is quite common, quite obvious. Whenever we say computer generated imagery, we are referring to mostly this type of scenarios, scenes or systems comprising of imaginary images, videos or scenes. Now, let us move to our second characteristic, that is sensory experience by computer generated stimuli. So, a VR system is supposed to provide to the user computer generated stimuli, so that environment can be experienced by the user. So, the implication is the immersive experience of the artificial or synthetic environment using our sensory organs such as eyes, ears, etc. So, the system should be able to generate stimuli that stimulates our sensory organs to give us the immersive experience, which is a hallmark of virtual reality system. So, that is the second characteristic. So, we should be able to sense whatever is provided or generated by the computer. Now, the third characteristic is user actions partially determine what happens in the environment. What is the implication of this characteristic? It indicates that the VR systems must be interactive in nature. In other words, dynamic change in the virtual environment is happening or should happen based on users' actions. So, user must be able to act, user must be able to do things in the environment, so that the environment changes by changing objects, by changing other things and so on. So, this is the third characteristic that a VR system must be interactive. A user should be able to interact with the elements present in the environment, just as we interact with the objects that surround us in our real world. In summary, what we can say is that there are three aspects of VR systems: artificial environment, that is synthetic graphical view of a real or imaginary world. Then it should be able to generate stimuli, so that we are able to experience immersion using our sensory organs. And third is interaction, that is dynamic change in the virtual environment based on users' actions, or rather inputs provided to the environment. So, these three are the defining characteristics of any given VR system. Now, let us see how we can utilize this knowledge. We can utilize this knowledge by using these three as a way to identify whether a system is a VR system or not. How we can do that? It is very simple. We just check for the three characteristics. If the system satisfies all of these characteristics, then it is a VR system, otherwise it is not. So, even if one characteristic is not supported, we cannot call it a VR system. Let us see few examples. So, I will be playing a few videos, so that you are able to better comprehend the examples. So, this is our first video. It is an example of a CAD or computer aided design system. So, what happened here? As if I replay it, you can see that there is a person sitting in front of a screen, and there are certain things happening on the screen. User can interact with the screen, with the content on the screen, as you can see here in the video, that based on that interaction, screen content is changing. Interaction mode is through mouse. The input device is mouse. Now, that is the system. Now, is it a VR system? Can I categorize it as a VR system? Rather than trying to directly answer it, let us try to do a characteristic check. Let us see which of the three characteristics it supports or do not support. If it supports all the three characteristics, then it must be a VR system. If it does not support at least one of those, then it cannot be called a VR system. So, let us first check. First thing is virtual environment. Is there a virtual environment present? Yes, there is a virtual environment. The screen content is virtual, of course. Can I call it immersive environment? That is it generating stimuli to stimulate all our sensory organs? No, it is not. It is only a computer screen. So we are able to see it, but along with that we are able to see things in the real world surrounding the computer screen. So it is not an immersive environment or immersive experience. Is there interaction here? Of course, as we have seen, there is interaction. So, among the three characteristics, that is virtual environment, immersive experience through sensory organs and interaction, it supports two, virtual environment and interaction, whereas it does not support the immersive experience part. So, clearly this is not a VR system. Now, here a note of caution. Earlier we talked about non-immersive VR. That is also kind of screen based 2D, this regular computer screen based experience. And in this previous lecture, I clarified why, although it is regular screen based, we are still calling it immersive experience. That is purely from a psychological point of view. However, that psychological constraint is not applicable in this particular application of CAD design, CAD system. Let us see one more video, a video conferencing system. So, the actual conversation is not important here, so you can skip it and we can come to the end of it. So, is it a VR system? So, here what is happening? Some people are sitting at different places on earth, they are connected through a video conferencing system. So, in front of them there is screen, so they are seeing things on a screen. Now, can I call it a virtual reality system? Let us again go for characteristics check and let us see whether they satisfy all the three characteristics. Virtual environment, is it a virtual environment? It is not really a virtual environment because everything is happening in real time. Although we are seeing it on a screen, but things are happening real time. So, if at this moment something is changing at one place, that is reflected immediately on the screen of others sitting at different places. So, it is not really virtual, it is a real world environment being viewed through a screen in real time. So, virtual environment, the first characteristic is not there. Surprisingly, of course, the second one is also clear that immersive experience is not there. We are actually in the real world, although only the screen is aiding our interaction in the real world rather than replacing it. So, we are not getting any immersive experience here, but it is interactive. So, in this case, in this particular example, one of the 3 characteristics is satisfied, whereas the other 2 are not satisfied. So, clearly it is not a VR system. Let us see one more example, that is a 3D movie. Nowadays it has become very popular. Most of the movies are 3D now. So, what happens in a 3D movie? We are wearing a sort of 3D glass, seeing things in 3D, supposedly 3D, sitting in an auditorium or a movie hall as shown in this small video.
This new experience is drawing audiences to see a fast-growing number of Hollywood films made in stereoscopic 3D. At Bug, we have the experience, the technical know-how, and creative talent to produce effective stereoscopic 3D content for your next campaign.
So, here as you can see, a user is supposed to wear a 3D glass. So, is it a VR system? Again, we will go by the regular route, that is checking the characteristics. Virtual environment, yes, we are experiencing a virtual environment here, clearly that is very obvious. Immersive experience, yes, it is, we can call it semi-immersive, of course not fully immersive, but still partly immersive, because we are blocking our visual sense and also partly blocking our auditory sense. And nowadays there are 7D or 8D movies also, where other senses may also be activated to experience the content. So, immersive experience partly yes, virtual environment yes. Only thing that is not there is interaction. So, here we are just watching, we are unable to change anything that is being displayed in front of us. So, the third characteristic, that is it must be interactive in nature, is not supported. Since that is not supported, so even if the other 2 are supported, we can still say that it is not a VR system. So, that is the conclusion, that a 3D movie experience is not a VR system. So, now I hope that it has become clear what we can call a VR system and what we cannot call a VR system. The idea is very simple. We have 3 characteristics of a VR system. We just need to check against those characteristics, and then based on that we need to conclude whether something is a VR system or not. So, in summary, what we have learned in this lecture, in this part of the lecture, is that we have learned definitions of VR, that is what is virtual reality, and based on the definition we have identified 3 characteristics, namely artificial environment, immersive experience, that is experience through our sensory organs, and interactivity. Based on these characteristics we can identify whether something is a VR system or not. In the next part of this lecture we are going to talk about augmented reality, namely the definition of augmented reality, characteristics of augmented reality, as well as the differences between AR and VR systems. So, with that we come to the end of this part of the lecture. I hope you have understood the concept, you have enjoyed it, and looking forward to see you again in the next part of the lecture. Goodbye, thank you and happy learning.